There was once a king in China who ruled all under heaven, but one day another state walked into his land and harvested his crops. No war was declared, no punishment followed, and the king could do nothing. It wasn't always like this. Long before that moment, the Zhou kings were powerful. They had conquered lands, defeated rivals, and established control over a vast territory. Their authority was not symbolic, it was real. They commanded armies, they decided outcomes, they defined order. To manage such a large world, they created a system. Instead of ruling everything directly, they divided the land. Territories were granted to relatives, allies, and trusted nobles. Each lord governed his own state, but all of them, in theory, served the king. This was the foundation of Zhou power, a network of loyalty, a structure of obligation. The king stood at the center. Everything pointed toward him. Everything depended on him. For a time it worked. For a time it held. But systems do not collapse all at once. They loosen, they drift, they weaken in places no one notices at first. The states grew stronger. Their rulers gained confidence. Their armies became independent. Their decisions became their own. Respect for the king remained, but respect is not control, and slowly an obedience disappeared. Among those states there was Zheng. Zheng was not large, but its land was fertile, its fields were rich, its harvests were reliable. It could sustain itself. It could support an army. It had resources, and resources meant power. Zheng was small, but it was not weak. It also had history. In earlier times, when the Zhou royal house faced danger, when northern tribes threatened the capital, it was Zheng's ancestors who escorted the king to safety. They had protected the royal house. They had stood close to power. And because of that, they were trusted. They were rewarded. They were given influence inside the royal court itself. Zheng was not just a state, it was part of the system. But history does not guarantee the future. As the royal house weakened, relationships changed. At one point, the king and Zheng even exchanged hostages. A royal prince, Prince Hu, was sent toward Zheng, but he never arrived. On the way, he fell seriously ill, and he died. His son later took the throne. This was King Huan of Zhou. And he remembered. He blamed Zheng. He resented Zheng. And once he had power, he acted. Zheng's influence at court was reduced. Its privileges were divided. Its position was weakened. Power that once belonged to Zheng was handed to others. Zheng understood exactly what was happening. It was being pushed out. And from that moment, the relationship was broken. But Zheng did not rush. It waited. Because it needed something, a reason. It wanted the king to act first. So it began with something small. They entered the king's land and started harvesting wheat. Not attacking, not occupying, harvesting. Men walked into the fields with tools in their hands. They worked methodically, like men who had done this many times before. They checked the crops, tested the grain, and chose the best areas first. They cut carefully, not hurried, not reckless, as if quality still mattered. Bundles were tied neatly, stacked in rows, ready to be carried away. Some even paused, looking over the fields as if planning what to take next. There was no shouting, no chaos, no sense of urgency. It looked less like an invasion and more like an unusually well-organized harvest season. If anything, they were treating the king's land with surprising professionalism. The king's fields were producing excellent results, and no one stopped them. The king was furious, but he did not act. His ministers advised restraint. They spoke of caution, of consequences, of timing. So nothing happened. No troops were sent, no punishment followed. And Zheng saw that, so they came back. This time for rice. Another season, another harvest. But this time there was a difference. They already knew the land. They knew which fields yielded the most. They knew which paths were easiest to move through. They knew exactly how long they could stay. They entered again with even less hesitation. They cut more efficiently, moved more quickly, worked with quiet confidence. If the first visit had been a test, this one was refinement. At this point, it almost felt organized, predictable. One could imagine that someone had already planned the route in advance, field by field, bundle by bundle. The king's land was no longer unfamiliar territory. It was understood, mapped, and usable. There was no longer any doubt. They were not trying something risky. They were doing something safe, because now they knew the outcome. Nothing would happen. After the second time, there was no more uncertainty. This was not an accident, not a misunderstanding. It was a pattern and a message. The king's authority did not exist where it mattered, on the ground. Only then did things escalate. What began in the fields moved toward open conflict. Forces were gathered, allies were called. Chen, Kai, Wei, a coalition formed. And the king himself led one of the armies. This was no longer about crops. It was about power. The armies met. Battle began. But what followed was not strength. It was exposure. The royal forces were not overwhelming. They were not decisive. And in the fighting, it happened. A general of Zheng raised his bow. An arrow struck King Huan of Zhou. It hit him, not a soldier, not an officer, the king himself. The moment was clear. The meaning was unmistakable. Even in battle, the king could be struck. The campaign ended without victory. The king had marched out to reassert authority and failed. And then, Zheng did something unexpected. Zheng Zhuanggong went to apologize, formally, respectfully, as if nothing had happened, as if order still existed, but everyone knew it didn't. From that moment on, Zheng rose. It became one of the earliest dominant states of the spring and autumn period, a small hegemon, not because it was the strongest, but because it had crossed a line and survived. In the end, the king still existed. His title remained. His rituals continued. He was still called the Son of Heaven, but power had moved elsewhere. Because once a king cannot protect his own land, once others can walk in, harvest his crops, leave and return again. He is no longer ruling anything. He is only being remembered. If you want to hear more strange but true stories from Chinese history, subscribe to Imperial Absurdity.